Well, hello, everyone. Welcome to another episode of Tales from the L&D Bookshelf. I'm your host, David Kelly. And in this episode, we're going to explore the big shift from designing courses to designing learning environments. I'm joined by Catherine Lombardozzi, who authored the book, and she's going to unpack that book, Learning Environments by Design, which helps L&D professionals curate meaningful, multi-layered ecosystems that support learners over time, not just during training. And we're going to talk about what it means to go beyond the classroom, how to support self-directed learning, and why being a curator, connector, and strategist is the future of our work. And we're going to revisit the principles and the insights from her book and bring them into the current context. So, Catherine, thank you so much for being our guest here today.
You're quite welcome. It's a joy to talk about it.
Looking forward to our conversation here. So, let's get started. I'm very familiar with your work, but for anyone who might be watching the podcast or listening to the podcast who isn't, can you tell us a little bit about the work that you do and the vision behind your book?
Sure. I've been a learning and development strategist for my entire career. For the most part, I was in management level positions, but I do a lot of strict instructional design. I design courses, I design academic courses, I do all that kind of work. And my calling has been to help to new professionals in the field and experienced professionals to upskill themselves, to really develop that skill set, to learn the new techniques and new tools and new ideas that are coming to the forefront in our field. So that's the kind of thing that I've been doing for my whole career and for the last 15 years in my own consulting practice.
And what inspired you? We talk about instructional design so often in our space. What inspired this shift in your thinking from ID towards learning environment design? What inspired that change in thinking for you?
Well, part of it certainly was too many people saying instructional design is dead, which is a little bit career threatening. So
Sure.
I thought perhaps maybe I should really take a look at that and try to understand what they were saying, even though I didn't believe them. So what they were saying was really, and what I believe is that back in the day, back in, the 2010s up to 2015 or so, that's when we really started talking about the fact that instruction was not the only tool in the toolbox. If we want to support learning, there are so many other things that we can do. And so when I really sat down to think through, okay, so what are those other things and how do I incorporate that into the strategies that I recommend to my clients and to the company that I work for? What does that look like? That's what bore the book. That's where I said, okay, let's look at the full array of ways that we can support learning in organizations, the ways that people learn, and how do we create an environment in which those things can come to life and to really enrich the learning experiences of our employees without necessarily just piling on more courses.
So we tend to use instructional design a lot in our field as kind of the default, but you're going beyond that. So if you picture this array of options that we have there as kind of a portfolio, what's in that portfolio? What sort of things are we including when you say learning environment design?
Yeah, that was a lot of fun to think through, to tell you the honest truth. So I sat down at that time and said, all right, what are those things? And made a long list. I made it based on books I'd been reading, based on conference presentations I'd seen, and adult learning theory that I've studied. There was just a lot of possible inputs that allowed me to create this big, long list of here's all the things that people use to learn in a work environment. Setting. And then I categorized them, and there were 5 categories. The first one category certainly is formal training, which includes your academic stuff, your training and development, on-the-job training, a lot of e-learning has very strict goals that they're trying to achieve. So training and education is certainly one of the buckets, but another bucket is resources. We had the whole scope of the internet that we could draw from, so there's books and articles and websites and videos and just all kinds of resources outside of an organization, as well as lots of resources inside an organization, your manuals, your history of presentations or history of things that the organization does, what your marketing materials say, all of that, right? So all of that is the resources bucket. Then there's a bucket that talks about people, right? So we should know, learning is a relational act, right?
Yeah.
really does depend on engaging with other people. So how do we really support that? That may mean peer learners, that may be mentoring, that may be helping people to work in collaborative projects or to observe other people. There's just so many different ways that you can learn from and with other people, and that could be part of our strategy. Then there's a bucket that I think originally I called developmental practices, which had to do with what the organization can do. So that's things like doing after action reviews and doing observations of employees and drive alongs with your salespeople and all the things that leaders do that support development that isn't part of the formal process, but is in fact part of the learning environment for people. I talked about those developmental practices. That was expanded a little bit when I did a lot of work in the area of self-directed learning because, category depended on the manager. But the fact of the matter is a lot of those things can be organized for yourself if you need that, right? So I started to call that just developmental activities, which may be inside of formal training programs, but often is not inside of formal training programs. And then the last category in the chart was learning by doing, because when I showed that original 4 list to people and said, this is what I think how people's learn, and they said to me, well, I don't know, I just learn it by doing it, which they don't just do it. They have reflective practices and they take notes and they, really evaluate themselves against some imagined checklist of what good looks like, right? So there's ways that you learn by doing that isn't just the act of doing the thing. And so that was the 5th bucket. So when I talk about designing a learning environment, I'm talking about looking across all of those categories and trying to pick and choose elements from hopefully all of those categories that can support the learning that you are trying to promote. Whatever the topic is, whatever the skill is, what are the resources and the people and the learning by doing that you can incorporate into a full-fledged strategy to support that learning?
This wide array of options that we have available to us is there, but just because we have the option doesn't necessarily mean we're going to take advantage of it. So like I mentioned earlier, like instructional design, we build a course by default. It's kind of it's a habitual behavior. So there's a mindset that needs to be built in order to really harness the opportunity of this. Like the resources are there, that's one thing, but there's also the mindset to harness the potential of these resources. How does one develop the mindset around shifting from what ID is to what the learning environment design could be?
Yeah, I think that's a really important insight that those are 2 different things because there is an assumption that we all learn. If you have to figure out how to fix your sink, you just Google it and you've learned how to fix your sink, right? So what's the big deal to do that for your work environment? So people just sort of thought, well, this is just going to be really easy for people. But the fact of the matter is in a work environment for the kinds of work skills we're trying to develop, people are unsure of themselves. They don't quite know how to go about it, what kinds of things would be useful. So just giving them free rein on the internet or to internal resources does not a learning environment make. A learning environment is structured. It's helpful to people. It gives annotations that say, if you want to learn this, here's where you go. There may be a start here page where you say, if you're brand new to this topic, these are the 3 or 4 things that can really bring you up to speed on the core concepts, right? So we have to scaffold that kind of learning and not assume that people just given free rein to even a narrow set of resources that we've curated are going to be able to use that effectively.
And what sort of, if we're able to do this, what sort of solutions, like how does the solution set change or evolve when you start looking at it through the lens of instead of just the traditional ID to a learning environment design? How does that change the end result of the solutions that we're able to create?
The flippant answer, I suppose, is that the world is open. There's so many possibilities for what this could look like. And in the book, I talk about doing guided learning journeys, which is one way to do it, or a blended learning hub, which means you've got a core course, but you're giving people additional resources around that, to something that is more free rein, like a collaboratory or a learning portal that just does give you access to a whole range of kinds of resources. To me, most of the time, what it looks like is a web page or some sort of access point that allows people to do that, which could, by the way, be a PDF. It doesn't even have to be a web page. It could be something very, very simple to get the information out that you need. And also couple that with some sort of links to other people. So when this kind of thing was initially being built, that was at the dawn of SharePoint, which was not anybody's favorite tool, but it did have the advantage of both being able to hold resources and to hold conversation between and among people, to give people an opportunity to contribute, and to give people an opportunity to have online conversations with one another in an asynchronous way, which was really useful in this kind of environment. You've got to think through how you give people access to all of these things, how you let them know what's available to them. And that's what the end product looks like, whatever that is. And it, like I say, for every project, it's going to look different.
So the book does go through a structured process for designing these environments. What are some of the key steps of that process?
The structured process, if you look underneath it, is kind of a sneaky Addy process. Basically does what we always do, just a little bit differently. But what's different about this process is your upfront, it really relies on your ability to upfront know the learners really well and define your topic and your goals really well, which isn't necessarily learning objectives as much as it is just a really good set of, what are people going to be able to what questions are people going to be asking when they go to these resources? That's a good place to start. So that's the envisioning part. And then you find and curate resources. There was a time, I remember it well, when we packaged everything. You always had to have, pretty booklets, and everything was branded by the organization, and you never ever gave people that was straight from an outside source. But these days, there's just no time and no reason to reinvent the wheel of stuff that's out there. So you've got to go out and find what's already available that people can use, that you can use to support people's learning. And then when you do that, you will find holes. So this is not in the diagram in the book, but there is a time when you have to pause and say, what do I need to create? Where are the holes? Where are the things that are going to help my learners to connect all this stuff to what we do here? That's much more customized. So you do have some design and development process for creating those elements. The big other thing then you have to do is figure out how to package it. So how are you going to give people access to this? Is it simply a list of links? Is it a web page? Is it your LMS? Does your LMS give you some sort of functionality that allows you to do this really efficiently and really well? Is there a SharePoint or SharePoint-like product that your organization uses that gives you the ability to do these things? So you have to think about what's the access to it? How do you make that friendly, user-friendly, and amenable? You don't want friction. You don't want people trying to figure things out. You want them to be able to see what's there and be able to access it right away. And then there is the process of continuously improving that, right? So the minute you put a link to the internet, you got a maintenance issue, right? Because you never know when those links are going to break or when something is going to go out of date or, whatever the case may be. So it is important to keep your eye on that. And maintenance, even in instructional design, has always been a big bugaboo in our field.
So it sounds, as I'm listening to you, it sounds like a lot of we talked about the creation of the different sorts of resources, but there's also a lot of identifying of existing resources that get plugged into the learning environment design. So it sounds like there's a curation aspect to all this. What role does curation play in learning environment design?
I think curation is the critical piece. If all you do is give people a dump of links, they could Google it. The curation part is not just finding stuff and saying this would be useful, but putting some context around it. So doing a 3-sentence annotation after the link that says, here's what you're going to learn if you open up this video. Or even better, open up this video, you can ignore the first 5 minutes. Go to Mark 5.2, that's where you're going to start to hear what's important to you, right? So annotating things and really giving people a little bit of guidance source by source is really an important part of the curation role when you're doing this kind of work.
Do you feel like that gets us over people, I'm just going to Google the answer? Does that help us get over, we talk about self-directed learning all the time, and people just going to kind of go and Google it. Is that where part of the USP of our role comes in? Is our ability to point out the resources that are more relevant?
Yes, it's making more judgment calls. I did an experiment when I did a workshop on this once where I Googled learning ecosystems. I said, let's say you need to learn learning ecosystem. Type that into Google. What do you get? What I would recommend you read to learn about learning ecosystems was on the 3rd page of Google. So what you save when you curate is people to plod through all kinds of things that are not useful for them,
Yeah.
are not on target, are not as clear as they could be or as rich as they could be. So that's what you get. Save people a tremendous amount of time in accessing resources that will be useful.
And that speaks to the trust that needs to exist in that curator relationship, but it also kind of has a parallel to the social and peer-based learning aspect that we talk about in that's so important to learning. What role does the social and peer-based element play in learning design, learning environment design?
I think it's a critical aspect of it. When I wrote the book, there were two sort of extra chapters. One was on social learning and one was
Mhm.
on self-directed learning, because you need to understand those dynamics. I think the social learning, people really need that. They really
Yeah.
need to be able to talk to people to make sense of what they're seeing and what they're hearing. It's not just a brain dump from the internet to your head and everything's perfect, right? I remember way back in the day an apocryphal story by Tony O'Driscoll. Do you remember Tony O'Driscoll? He's
Sure.
still at Duke, but he was at IBM at the time. And what he said was IBM did this big project to make accessible all of their consultants' resources, the slide decks, the research papers, the recommendations, all of that stuff was made available to their consultants in this big, huge database. And what they found was that people would access the database to look at projects that were similar to what they had. They would figure out who wrote those things and they would call them. So it was a very expensive telephone directory
Yeah.
of who knows what in the organization. And
Interesting.
that's not necessarily a bad thing, but
Mhm.
that just goes to show how important it is to talk to people. There's a book called The Social Life of Information. It was written in like 2000 by John Seeley Brown and Paul Duguid. I think I'm saying that name right. But at any rate, it says very clearly that information is not static. It needs the people to bring it to life. And we can't forget that.
Let's shift gears a little bit towards what this really looks like in practice. What does it look like in an organization? Because sometimes we talk about things as if it's a petri dish and it's a perfect controlled environment. Most organizations are not like
Mhm.
that. So how does this environment design approach work in a real organization? Can you give us an example of what it looks like in practice?
Yes, I can. Very few examples though, because I get to tell people about it, but then I don't get to see what they do with it, which is very disappointing as a consultant. So I haven't seen as much of it as I would like. But when I talk to people, what I hear is a lot of blended learning hub work. That is that they really work to make additional resources and people accessible beyond a training program to help keep the learning going. And these days, especially in the leadership development space, but I think it's true in a lot of other spaces, it's very important for people to have coaching or peer learning initiated as part of a learning environment,
Yep.
and very important to have enriching resources, things that people can access that go beyond what the basics were that they might have learned in a training program. So that looks like anything, like we've been talking already, anything from a list of links to a web page to some sort of a shared database site that gives people access to all of those things.
And this gets applied in context depending on what the unique resources and environment of an organization is. I always feel that applies in just about every case. I'm not really there aren't many absolutes in L&D that I am comfortable with because everything is so subjective to an organization's culture. But one absolute I'm kind of comfortable with is that no matter what the initiative is, the manager is often in control of whether or not it can be successful because if you don't have the manager support, a lot of times
Mhm.
things will just die.
That's true.
Fairly universal thing in my experience
I
of this.
agree.
So what role does the manager play in terms of this shift? How do we need to make sure that they're on board?
Helping them to understand the dynamics of learning and how to support that is certainly part of that.
Mhm.
What they actually do hands on is work with learners to help to identify their learning goals and clarify them, point them in the direction of these learning resources, whatever they have. They've got a learning environment for certain skills that they might want to grow in their organization, to point employees in that direction, to be familiar with what's in there so they can further clarify what they think a particular employee might want to have right now. So that sort of close support for individual development, I think, is important. They also play as a social role, right? So they can be a coach, they can be a sounding board, they can be an observer to see whether or not people are able to engage the skills that they're learning in the way that they want to. So they have that role to play. And among the most important roles that they have to play is to give people time to do it. When you assign people to a training program, they're out of pocket for 4 hours or 4 days or whatever the case may
Hmm.
be. When you give them a learning environment, you have no idea what kind of time they need to engage with and absorb and translate that information. And we have a very sad habit of thinking it's magically going to happen without giving them time, so letting people, and I remember working with a client once, we were working on project management skills, and we were working on a developmental program, not just a training program, but something that lasted over time. And the guy said to me, our project managers are scheduled at 125% of capacity.
Okay, then.
Where are they going to learn if they're scheduled? And I mean, I know that doesn't mean they actually are working at
Yeah.
125% because what you get scheduled for and what you actually need to do the work are not always the same thing. But still, come on, you really need to give people time to learn. And that's hard to judge and hard to do sometimes.
So, speaking of roles, in my experience, I don't see many people with the role of learning environment designer. Unfortunately, in the time that I've been here, most new methodologies or new approaches to it just get added to the ID's job
Isn't
description.
that the truth? Yeah.
The instructional designer role is much bigger than the words would necessarily imply. Are there new, as you think about this shift from what an ID traditionally does to where we need to go, and to be more effective in this approach, are there new roles or new skills that L&D professionals need to be considering to really support this?
Yeah. In terms of the role, there's no shortage of titles that people want to give
Yeah.
to instructional designers. My favorite one is learning experience designer because I
Hmm.
think that's a catch-all for everything. Though the skills needed are very similar to instructional design. That's why we keep giving it to instructional designers because they have to have the needs analysis skills. They've got to have the understanding of adult learning and how learning dynamics operate in order to make this work. So it's perfectly logical that people with instructional design background can do this kind of work. What's new is, do they have the internet search capability? Do they
Yeah.
have the ability to vet what they find on the internet? Just because it looks spiffy doesn't mean it's from a credible source. So especially these days. So I think that is an important piece. And just having a real affinity for the learning experience, right? So the learning experience design skill set, I think, is critical to really take a look at what this looks like and feels like from inside the learner and make sure that it's accessible, it's easy to create, it's easy to understand where you're supposed to go next and what might be useful. It's easy to identify your goals and to find the resources to meet those goals. So looking at things from the point of view of the learner, I think, is critically
I want
important.
to shift gears a little bit to your reflections as the author of this book.
Mhm.
Um, so, thinking back to the time that the book has been published, conversations that you've had with people who've read the book, has anything surprised you in terms of the way that when people have reacted to the book? Be it maybe something in the way people have reacted or applied the insights, maybe something you didn't consider when you were writing it.
What I found interesting was how many people had a similar idea at the same time. And learning
Okay.
experience design as a term did not win the game, right? What came to the forefront was learning ecosystems. That was the terminology that people adopted, and there are lots of books on learning ecosystems and lots of leading thinkers who have different approaches to creating such a thing as what I call a learning experience, a learning environment, I mean. And so great ideas occur to a lot of people at the same time. The other thing that I think surprised me a little bit, and certainly surprises people who have attempted to do this work, is that people are not as adept at self-directed learning as you think adults might be.
Yeah.
You figure we've got so many DIYers in the world that, of course, they will be able to sort this all out, but they don't. They can't. And, they've been brought up in school systems that had a lot of structured learning. And so it's not something that we've taught people to do. So I think that's a surprise to people that they do have to do more scaffolding than they would like to, than that they want to do.
One of the, I was saying to you before we started the podcast, one of the reasons I wanted to have these discussions with authors like yourself is I've got all these books that are on the shelf, and I pull them off every now and then to reference them. But a lot of them, just because they're on the shelf doesn't necessarily, and they've been on the shelf for a couple of years, doesn't necessarily mean that the insights aren't still there. Your book is a great example. It's almost 10 years old now. If you were going to revise the book today based on the experiences that you've had over the last decade, what might be different? What might be different about your approach, or anything you might add if you did a new edition of the book?
Yeah, there is a lot of work. I've done work since then. Obviously, the book was published 10 years ago. I've done workshops and conference presentations on all different angles of the work that's in there. So all of that has been enriched. So there's plenty of new ideas and nuances that I would add in terms of what blended learning looks like, what the options are, what the tools are, right? So there's plenty more things available to us in our toolkit than were available. And I would probably want to speak explicitly to different kinds of tools that people might use and how they can make them work effectively in this kind of a design. So all of that, I think, would be new in a 2026, 2027 version of the book. And probably I need to think about what role I wanted to put AI in this sort of environment. But I'm a really serious skeptic of AI. So it's not going to be me that writes that book. Somebody else is going to have to write that book.
What makes you skeptic about it? I'm curious.
I am very leery of the continued hallucinations, the lack of accuracy in what they do. There's a lot of problems in powering it and resource consumption of AI tools. All of the energy that goes into it, all the water that goes into it, all of those kinds of things. From a learning perspective, it can be really comforting to think you can let AI give you the answer, but it generated it from a vast array of nuanced stuff. And we already have trouble with people trying to act from bullet points, to try to act from AI bullet points really scares me. So I think AI is going to be useful for a lot of things, but directly applied to learning may not be the most immediate use case that we have. That's my thought.
Yeah, I hear some other concerns. It's going to be interesting to see how it all shakes out. So shifting gears for our final question here from you as the author to you as a reader. What are some of the things that you might have been reading or checking out lately that you have found interesting that you might want to recommend other people check out?
I continue to believe that if you understand the dynamics of learning, you can use whatever tools get thrown at you and figure out how to put them to best use for the thing that you're trying to do. But it really starts with a core understanding of learning. So I love reading new stuff about learning, but more importantly, I love rereading old stuff about learning that's still seminal. So I mentioned The Social Life of Information. I had opportunity recently to go through my yellow marker on that book. And, really important stuff that hits very differently now than it did when I read the book in 2000. So work like that, work like The Power of Pull by John Hagel and John Seeley Brown. Also seminal in this space is going to hit a lot differently now than it did back then. Lots of great ideas there. Work on the communities of practice, I think, is critical. And Etienne Wenger, who's one of the foundational thinkers in that space, is still doing active work and has lots of interesting ideas related to digital communities as well as what was traditionally spoken of as communities of practice. So it's that kind of thing that I would recommend people explore. And it would what they would explore would depend on what they're doing, what they're interested in, what they're worried about. There would be something different for each person, I think.
Topic like this, I find when I explore topics like this, sometimes they can just seem overwhelming in their scope, and because we tend to focus on the end point of we've gone through all the change management and all this growth and all of this cultural advancements to get to this visionary endpoint, and it can feel overwhelming. If we wanted to bring it back to the start, what's like one small thing that somebody could do to start building this mindset and building this skill around the shift from ID towards a more broad learning environment design?
I do think it's understanding the dynamics of learning. I'll go back to what I just said. I remember back in the 2010s or something, we were trying to teach our instructional designers how to do e-learning design. They were classroom designers. And I remember speaking to a person out of a major company, and I said, do you think we can do that? Can we make people who know how to do training in classrooms be instructional design? And her answer to me never left me. She said, if you know adult learning, you can do anything, And so To me, that is the foundational skill set, not do I know how to do an ADDIE process? Do I know how to program the LMS? Those are not the foundational skills for design, instructional design or learning environment design. The foundational skill is understanding the dynamics of learning.
Great. That's a great reminder for us to close on. Catherine, I want to thank you so much for being our guest here today. If people want to learn more about the work that you do or reach out, how can they learn more about your work and contact you?
I have a website, L4LP.com. That's learning for the number 4 learning professionals. So it's L4LP.com. I have a section on there called curated resources where I put introductory thoughts and lots of links for many of the topics that are of interest to people who work in this field. They've been building up over years. So there's a lot of interesting things there that you could take a look at. So that's where I would follow me, so to speak. I mean, I do post on LinkedIn and occasionally post on Blue Sky, but not very often because there's not many of us there, to care. So I don't worry about that too much. In, these days, I'm moving into living at the beach mode and kind of, fading a little bit from the L&D stuff. And I'm writing more on a personal level. And there you can find me at cmtl.me.
Excellent. Well, I look forward to checking that out. Well, thank you again for being our guest here today. And thank you for those of you that are watching our podcast. Thank you for joining us for this episode. We will see you again soon on Tales from the L&D Bookshelf. Thanks, everybody.
Thank you.